Wamanjika, and welcome, friends, to part 31 of our God Squad series from Mark's Gospel as we follow Jesus on the road with his disciples. Thanks for joining us today, and I hope you're enjoying our journey so far. My name is Barro from the Melbourne chapter of God Squad here in Australia, and it's good to be back sharing after a few months away. Today's reading comes from Mark chapter 8, verses 1 to 13, and is entitled, Jesus Feeds the 4,000. It's a story of hospitality, compassion, about who's in and who's out, and I want to bring a few brief thoughts about it today. Firstly, my wife Helen and I have just returned recently from 10 weeks away in Vietnam, where we were treated to incredible hospitality, where we were invited into people's homes, even when there was language barriers, and we were shown generous hospitality as strangers, as people treated us to some incredible food along the way. And it reminded me a bit of today's story, because again, we see that there's a great connection between Jesus and food, and who we eat with is important. Over the past 2 weeks, we've seen from Dave Fuller and Buckshot that Jesus and his disciples have been in the Gentile territory throughout chapter 7 and into chapter 8 that we read today. Going on from what Dave reminded us last week, Jesus and his disciples are in the region of Decapolis, near the Sea of Galilee. We know that for a Jewish person, this is a big deal, because traditionally Jews looked down the noses at the Gentiles. They saw them as inferior, and they should not mix with each other. They were the enemy. And much like today in the Middle East, racial tensions were really high. Jews would have considered themselves insiders, and Gentiles were definitely the outsiders. And Jewish religious leaders, such as the Pharisees, who Jesus meets again at the end of today's story, definitely consider themselves insiders. They were the right people, and they were the ones who decided who was worthy and who was not, because they were the power holders. So the disciples traveling with Jesus in this journey would have already been on edge. They would have already been feeling very uncomfortable mixing with Gentiles, because that's not something that a good Jew should have done. Jesus' disciples, though, also would have been learning that Jesus didn't do things the traditional way, especially rules about who was inside and who was out. Jesus was often already had the reputation of being a bit of a rule breaker. And once again, we see here that Jesus subverts the normal way or the expected way of doing things, and today's story is no different. Again, we see that he responds with generous compassion, grounded in love and grace, that trumps over religious and cultural rules about who is in and who is out, about who we should help and who we should not, about who is worthy and who is not, about who we hang out with and who we should despise. So let's read today's gospel reading from Mark chapter 8. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people, for they have already been with me these 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come a great distance. His disciples answered, But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. And they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told his disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Here we have a second miraculous feeding story in Mark's Gospel. The first one, back in Mark chapter 6 from a few weeks ago, is the feeding of the 5,000. I always wonder, why is today's story included? You've got these two similar stories, quite close in Mark's Gospel. Well, we know that the first feeding story, the feeding of the 5,000, was largely to a Jewish group in a Jewish territory. In fact, I'd probably say to an entirely Jewish group. And it's already, as we've already noted, today's story is in a Gentile area. So there are some themes and patterns that are similar to both these stories that I just want to highlight now. Jesus sees the crowd and is moved with compassion. He asks his disciples to feed them. The disciples are not sure what to do because the situation seems impossible. Jesus asks them what resources they have already with them. And in both cases, it's just a little, some loaves and some fish. Jesus gives thanks and tells his disciples to distribute it. And you can imagine the disciples thinking, this isn't going to go very far. And of course, we know that in both stories, there is more than enough to go around. In fact, both stories have recorded that there's heaps extra. So we see right throughout Mark's gospel that Jesus is constantly crossing barriers and crossing boundaries. He's hanging out with the Gentiles, the outsiders, the poor, the lame. He's talking to women and treating all with respect and dignity and grace, again subverting what was expected from him as a Jewish religious leader. This caused so much trouble with the Pharisees, the powerful ones who were the keepers of the law. In fact, as we've seen already, that at the end of today's story, the Pharisees again challenged and questioned him over his actions. And we know that there are over 20 recorded instances in the Gospels where Jesus and the religious leaders clash. These conflict narratives are always as a response to Jesus showing love and compassion to the outsider and breaking the rules as imposed by the religious elite. Again, we see that for Jesus, and I would suggest for us again today, that we are to be marked as people of love, grace, and compassion, not by people who are the keepers of the right rules, which in the end actually keep people out and lock people away from God's grace and goodness. Our former president, the late John Smith, used to say that the Pharisees acted with a motive of orthodoxy, that is, always wanting to be right. Yet Jesus acted with a motive of orthopraxis, or orthopraxy, that is, wanting to do what is right. And Smitty always challenged us to follow Jesus in doing what is right. We see from a few weeks ago a note about bread. Buckshot reminded us in the story of the faith of the Gentile woman who asked Jesus to heal her daughter that there was an awkward exchange in which Jesus says to her, "First tell the children, eat what they want, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." And in that particular exchange, the dogs he was referring to were the Gentiles. "Lord," she replied, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs," meaning the Gentiles. And with her response, Jesus commands her faith and heals the daughter. So back to today's story, we see that Jesus is not satisfied just to give them a few scraps. We see that all 4,000 are fed and are satisfied, including the dogs and the children. He provides a feast, not just scraps. So there is much more, so much more that there is 7 baskets left over. What a great image of hospitality and compassion. And through it, Gentiles, outsiders, are invited to share in the abundance of God's kingdom. And for the disciples and the Pharisees at the time, that was a radical thing. It's not what was expected. I wonder how we continue to follow this Jesus today. Some of you know that I run a local charity here, or I'm involved in a local charity here in Melbourne called Foothills Community Care. And amongst other things, we provide meals and safe spaces for people who would normally miss out, people who are struggling with homelessness, struggling with addictions, living on their own, single mums, people with mental health challenges and so on. And one of our big things, as I said, is providing meals and safe spaces for people to connect. So back in March 2020, when the whole world turned upside down, we had to close our dining rooms. We weren't allowed to have people come in and gather. And so we struggled to know what to do. Funds were also drying up. We weren't allowed to fund. We couldn't fundraise like we normally could. And funds were drying out. But we were determined to continue to follow Jesus, to treat people with dignity and respect, and to be generous. And so we found ways to serve. And so we would just go out to the streets and distribute meals to people on the streets. We would deliver meals into people's homes. And we were determined to keep going, to keep struggling along, even if it looked like that we were going to go bankrupt at the time. The image that kept coming back to me was, how would Jesus treat people? And I believed it was to be generous and to be compassionate. After about 6 weeks of doing this, it was this story from Mark's Gospel of Jesus feeding the 4,000, feeding the Gentiles, that just kept coming back over and over and over again. And in a strange, interesting twist, at the end of that week, I looked at the stats of how many meals that we'd actually distributed in the 6 weeks since restrictions started, and it was 4,000 meals. And I thought that was a really interesting way of God saying, you're on the right track. In fact, now we distribute over 45,000 free meals a year. And our motto, attempting to model ourselves on Jesus, is that everyone is welcome at our table. Because we see that's what Jesus did. He welcomed everyone at his table. He wasn't worried about his reputation. He was more concerned about making sure everyone was included. You see, for Jesus, who we eat with says a lot about our values and what we believe. Who do we invite to our table? Who do we have coffee with? Who do we hang out with? Is it people just like us? Or is it those constantly told that they are the outsider, that they are not worthy? Again, we see in this story that Jesus is not just satisfied in giving a few table scraps, but provides a feast. I reckon Mark was challenging his original hearers, and us again today, to look at the question, do we follow a stingy God or a generous, compassionate God? Do we limit God's hospitality to others by our actions? Or do we display God's love and compassion to others as fully as we can today by the way we treat other people around us? Are we more worried about those people who are a little bit different from us? Do we want to just keep to our own kind? Or are we, like Jesus, prepared to step out of our safe comfort zones? You see, Jesus often located himself on the margins, with people who were told they were not good enough, outsiders, not from the right space, not from the right social class. If that is how he lived his life with his disciples, then why is it that we continue to get it so wrong today and are more concerned, as Smitty said, about the Pharisees motivated by orthopraxy and having the right rules, even if they shut people out? The challenge, I believe, is to be more like Jesus and be driven by orthopraxis, that is, living the right way, living the way of Jesus. May today we continue to follow Jesus down the narrow road, and as we conclude this part of Mark's Gospel in Gentile territory, next week, Sean continues our journey with the story of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Herod. And as we close today's reflection, we are again reminded that Jesus came to comfort the disturbed and to disturb the comfortable. May we continue to do the same. God bless you and take care. Amen.